So this is my 1989 Jeep Cherokee, which I've converted to be fully electric, and I've recently added a second motor into it, so we're just going to go over that, and I'm going to do a little overview. So as you can see here, this is the original motor at the back here. Original as in it's the first electric motor I added in. Obviously it's not the original motor, which was inline 6 that comes standard with the Jeep Cherokee. And so we added this second motor in here. This motor is exactly the same as the first one here. It's an AC50 at 96 volts. And so these motor and controller combos are actually designed to that they can work in a pair. So the one of the controllers for these will act as the primary, and the other one will act as the secondary. And the primary will just relay its instructions to the secondary, and it will just mimic. So these essentially function once they're put together as one big motor. And so they just have right here, we mated them together, and there's actually just a coupler inside here that we can't really see from here. I'll try to maybe get a little video in there. You can see the coupler in there, and there's the little nylon spider in between. And so they're just directly coupled together, and so they rotate as one, and they rotate exactly in sync, and they have the same torque and everything. So there's not really much additional torque put on here, and then it just basically connects down to the transmission, which you can see down there, same as normal. This has actually worked out super well. I have lots of power now with the one motor. It was a little underpowered for the Jeep. It worked okay, but the motor would get pretty warm, and I didn't have a lot of power going up hills or starting off at lights and stuff. It was a little slow. It was okay for city driving, but it was right on the bottom end. Whereas with two motors, it works great. I have tons of power. I actually I almost have a little bit too much power right now. You see these engine mounts here? They're actually pretty skookum, but they flex and sort of bend a little bit if you really stomp on it in first gear. There's so much sort of immediate torque from these motors that you'll get a bit of a flex, and it's only a little bit of flex up here, but it amounts to actually way down, at the end there, which you can't really see, but at the back of the transmission, it'll actually move sort of 3 to 4 inches, which is actually quite a lot. So it'll put the drive shaft kind of out of alignment, and you can actually see the gear shift move quite a bit up inside. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to, you can see part of it here, we just haven't finished yet. So we're going to do a mount on the front here as well that's going to connect to this support member here. So it's going to be mounted to the frame up here and back there. And so that's going to give us sort of the advantage of leverage in these 2 points. And so that should make it a lot more secure. So it's totally fine. It doesn't flex when you're driving normally, but if you try to stomp it off of a light and, beat some Honda with a silly exhaust, you will beat the Honda, hypothetically, and but you will kind of bend or flex your mounts a little bit. So once you get this put in, then I can go back to challenging cars off the stoplight. Okay, so this is looking inside the hood. This is the second controller that got added. The first one, which you can't really see, but is down here. It's just mounted flat along here. It looks exactly the same as this. It's just mounted vertically. And so this is the secondary one, and it's just connected up. Over here, it actually just uses a CAN bus connection, which is the same sort of connection that pretty much anything in a modern vehicle, from engine information to making the windows go up and down, all that stuff is sent by that protocol. So these just connect directly together with their own sort of little CAN bus network, and it just uses that to communicate all the signals. You'll see here I got these covers off the internet here, but they've sort of melted a little bit around here, so I think I'm going to actually have to, it's not serious, the plastic just gets a little soft, but I think I'm going to have to get some new ones of these. The other ones I have don't melt at all, but I think these ones just don't seem to be able to handle the sort of warmth of the voltage that happens in here. We'll see. Maybe there's just a tiny bit of dust or something in these connections, and they're getting just a little warmer than they need to be. but I'll have to investigate that. But I think it's just that these are kind of crummy, really, because I haven't had that problem with any of the other covers that I have. So surprisingly, these covers are pretty hard to find, actually. They don't tend to exist a lot in this big wire stuff. You have to sort of get things that are meant for welding or some sort of industrial application, because you can't just sort of, it's not that easy to get a hold of EV parts, especially up here in Canada. So I might either get some sent up, from down at the coast from a guy I know who has some good ones, or I might try to find some other ones. So I talked about the temperatures getting a little high when I just had one motor in here initially. So the temperature would get up to, the temperature for both the controller and the motor actually would get up close to 100 degrees, which is basically the sort of safety threshold for these. So once it gets about, starts to get close to 100, about 90 and upwards, it starts to throttle the power down so that you don't overheat. And I wouldn't get that problem all the time, but if it was quite hot out and I drove up a bit of hills, or I'd gone for a fairly long drive, the heat would start to build up, and sometimes I would get towards the threshold because I was just using the motor to basically its maximum capacity lots for starting off or going up hills, things like that. And that's 100 degrees Celsius, so that's quite warm. Once I've added the second controller in, though, and I'm running two motors, I'm running them at a lot less load pretty much all the time. And so they run at a much better temperature. They probably don't get above about 50, 55 degrees Celsius for either the motor or the controller. And that's pretty consistent. That's even when it's really hot out. That's when it's over 30 degrees out. And I can even drive for quite a long ways. So I went on I drove for over 100 kilometers along the highway, up and down hills and everything. And I didn't have any heating problems. They just stay right around 50, 55. So really no heating issues there. They're totally solved by just not running them so heavy. I don't run any water cooling or anything. I just have, see this one here, they come with this sort of stock big aluminum plate here, which functions as a heatsink, and then I have this sort of custom aluminum bracket here, and it has a couple fins down here that you can't really see. See, maybe we can show in there. Can't see too much, and so this acts as a big heatsink. This is just mounted down to the frame, but it's pretty good. Some air can sort of flow under it, and it seems to do pretty well at keeping this cool. And then I also have this, the second controller over here. It has this, there's this big sort of aluminum sheet here. It's not too thick, but it goes across the whole way where the radiator was, and it kind of just covers out my engine bay, and I actually have a bunch of stuff mounted to it on the inside. And then I also have this there's quite a thick piece. It's sort of hard to see the details, but you can sort of see where the bolt lines are there and stuff. So there's quite a thick piece here that I think it's a 3/8 inch piece. And so that acts as a bit of a heat sink as well. The controller's mounted directly on the other side of this, so the air sort of hits here and it cools it down. It's not super high tech or anything, but it works quite well, and it doesn't involve any pumps, or anything like that. So there's really nothing that can go wrong with a big aluminum plate. There's no leaks and there's no pump issues or anything. So that works quite well. It's even it's September here now, and gone all through the summer, and I've had absolutely no heating problems whatsoever. Now, as for the specs, so these are two motors, and so you basically literally just take the specs of one and you add it to the specs of the other, and that's how much you have. So that amounts to about just a little bit over 200 foot-pounds of torque and about 300 horsepower. Although those numbers don't sort of perfectly reflect, because that should be similar in spec to what the inline 6 was that was originally in here, and having driven both of those, there's really no comparison. There's way more power on the electric motor. First of all, I can drive in second gear from 0 to like 140 kilometers an hour, no problem, and it's got pretty good pickup all the way, and you'll accelerate, even between 110 and 130, it has great pull, and you can shift down to first, and then you will have just a ton of power, and you can still go up to over 100 kilometers an hour, but you will just have a crazy amount of torque at the beginning. You can actually spin the wheels even, which is pretty crazy. I have actually some 31-inch, 10.5 inch wide wheels here, and you can spin them if you absolutely crank it in first gear. And so that's pretty crazy, because that's a lot of surface area to spin here. And that's a lot of weight to move. So it's not the same. You definitely couldn't do that just from a stop with the regular motor. So it's pretty cool that way. And I don't really know how to, if you haven't driven an electric vehicle, it's a little bit hard to describe, but the power is definitely different. It's just this sort of flat thing. It's like if you drop the clutch, you know, and you just lurched, but it's like that the whole way, but it's kind of smoother. It's really hard to describe, but just if you're comparing specs with torque or with horsepower directly to a gas vehicle, it's not quite the same. You have to experience it to understand it, but in generally you're going to get more sort of usable power for what seems like the same specs.